What I'm about to tell you will shatter every concept you've ever held about death, the afterlife, and the architecture of human suffering. This is not a story born from imagination or metaphysical speculation. This is the account of Arthur Sterling's final moments on Earth, a forbidden truth that has been systematically suppressed by religious institutions, governmental shadow organizations, and interdimensional entities who have orchestrated humanity's spiritual imprisonment for thousands of years. What happened in that hospice room on a cold November evening in Bar Harbor, Maine, defies every law of physics, challenges the foundation of organized religion, and exposes the most terrifying secret ever concealed from the human race, that death is not an end, and heaven is not what we've been promised. This is the story of a man who, in his last breath, discovered the cosmic trap that has enslaved billions of souls and made a choice that would echo across dimensions. Arthur Sterling had lived 84 years on this planet, and for most of that time, he had been a man of absolute precision and unshakable logic. As a master watchmaker in the small coastal town of Bar Harbor, Maine, Arthur had dedicated his entire adult life to the repair and restoration of timepieces, those intricate mechanical universes where every gear, every spring, every jeweled bearing had to align in perfect harmony, or the whole system would fail. There was something deeply satisfying about that level of control, that absolute predictability. In a world that felt increasingly chaotic and meaningless, Arthur found peace in the ticking certainty of a well-regulated movement, in the predictable arc of hands sweeping across a dial, measuring out the moments of other people's lives with mathematical perfection. But Arthur's own life had been anything but precise. Despite his mastery over the mechanics of time, he had never managed to master the mechanics of his own heart, his own grief, his own devastating loneliness. For 30 years, Arthur had lived as a ghost in his own existence, haunted by the inexplicable disappearance of his wife, Eleanor. It had happened on a September night in 1994, a night when the coastal fog had rolled in so thick that the lighthouse beams couldn't penetrate more than a few feet into the swirling gray. Eleanor had been in the garden, Arthur remembered, tending to her roses under the dim glow of the porch light. He had gone inside to answer the phone, a call that turned out to be a wrong number, and when he returned to the garden less than 3 minutes later, Eleanor was gone. Not just gone, vanished, as if she had been erased from reality itself. There were no footprints leading away from the garden, no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. The police investigation had been brief and dismissive. They filed it as voluntary abandonment, suggesting that Eleanor had simply decided to leave her marriage, had arranged some secret escape, had walked away from her life without a word. But Arthur knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic or evidence, that something far more inexplicable and terrifying had occurred that night. He had felt it, a presence in the fog, a watching intelligence that was neither human nor earthly. He had heard Eleanor's voice just for a moment, calling his name with a tone of wonder rather than fear, and then silent, absolute and complete. In the 3 decades that followed, Arthur had become a shell of himself. His workshop, once filled with the pleasant chaos of dozens of clocks ticking in overlapping rhythms, fell silent as he took on fewer and fewer repair jobs. He stopped attending church, stopped socializing with neighbors, stopped participating in the community that had once valued his quiet craftsmanship. He ate mechanically, slept poorly, and spent most of his waking hours replaying that night in his mind, searching for some clue, some explanation that would make sense of the impossible. The local doctors diagnosed him with chronic depression and prescribed a rotation of medications that dulled the sharpest edges of his grief, but did. nothing to fill the void that Eleanor's disappearance had torn in the fabric of his reality. And then, in the autumn of his 84th year, Arthur's body began to fail. It started with fatigue so profound that he could barely climb the stairs to his bedroom, progressed to confusion and memory lapses that frightened him more than any physical pain, and culminated in a diagnosis that was delivered with clinical detachment by a doctor young enough to be his grandson. Multiple organ failure, cascading and irreversible, with perhaps 3 to 6 weeks remaining. Arthur was moved to a hospice facility on the outskirts of Bar Harbor, a converted Victorian mansion with views of the rocky coastline and the endless gray Atlantic. He was given a private room on the 2nd floor, a space that felt sterile and impersonal despite the facility's attempts at warmth, with pale yellow walls, a single window overlooking the sea, and medical equipment that beeped and hummed with mechanical indifference. His only visitors were distant relatives, nephews, and a niece he barely knew, middle-aged strangers who had materialized as soon as word of his condition spread through the family network. They came with forced smiles and empty consolations, but Arthur could see the calculation in their eyes, the unspoken assessments of his estate, the barely concealed impatience for the whole unpleasant business to conclude, so they could divide up his modest savings and sell his house. He felt nothing toward them, not anger or resentment, just a weary recognition that this was how his life would end, surrounded by people who didn't know him, in a room that meant nothing, waiting for an oblivion he had stopped believing in decades ago. On the night it happened, Arthur lay in his hospice bed, watching the November sky darken beyond his window. The room was dimly lit by a single bedside lamp and the soft glow of monitoring equipment. His nephew Marcus and niece Jennifer sat in chairs near the door, scrolling through their phone with expressions of practiced patience. Arthur's breathing had become labored, each inhale a conscious effort, each exhale a small surrender. The morphine drip kept the physical pain at a manageable level, but it did nothing for the spiritual agony that had defined his existence since Eleanor vanished. He closed his eyes, not sleeping, but retreating into the darkness behind his eyelids, and wondered if death would bring answer or just more nothing. That was when the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly and so drastically that Arthur's breath became visible, crystallizing in small clouds before his face. The change was immediate and shocking, as if someone had opened a doorway directly into the Arctic. Marcus and Jennifer looked up from their phones, confused and startled, pulling their jackets tighter around themselves. But before either could speak, before anyone could move or question what was happening, a profound silence descended on the room, a silence so absolute that it seemed to nullify sound itself. The beeping of the heart monitor ceased. The hum of the fluorescent lights disappeared. Even the distant sounds of the hospice, the footsteps in the hallway and the murmur of nurses at their station were swallowed by this oppressive, unnatural quiet. And then Arthur saw it. A light, but not the kind of light he had expected. Not the soft white glow described in near-death accounts and religious texts. This was a pulsating violet radiance that seemed to emerge from the very air itself, coalescing in the corner of the room near the window. The light moved and shifted with liquid fluidity, condensing and taking form, and Arthur watched with a mixture of terror and recognition as it shaped itself into a figure, a being, an entity that transcended every category his logical mind tried to impose upon it. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 feet in height, with a slender, elongated form that appeared simultaneously solid and translucent. Its body seemed to be composed of light and energy rather than flesh and bone, a luminous structure that pulsed with internal rhythms Arthur could feel resonating in his own failing organs. The being's face, if it could be called a face, was smooth and featureless except for two large almond-shaped eyes that radiated a liquid, ancient compassion, a depth of understanding that made Arthur feel simultaneously seen and exposed in a way he had never experienced. The eyes were not judgmental, but infinitely knowing, as if this being could perceive every moment of Arthur's 84 years in a single glance, every joy and sorrow, every hope and failure, every secret shame and unspoken longing. Arthur's first thought, rising from decades of cultural conditioning, was that this must be an angel, that death had finally come for him in a form biblical and divine. But as the being stepped closer to his bed, moving without seeming to walk, gliding through space as if the laws of physics were optional suggestions rather than immutable rules, Arthur knew with absolute certainty that this was not an angel, not in any religious sense. This was something else entirely, something that existed outside the framework of human theology and cosmology. And then, without any movement of lips or tongue, without any vibration of air or sound reaching his ears, Arthur heard a voice inside his mind, a communication that bypassed language entirely and transmitted meaning directly into his consciousness. The voice was neither male nor female, neither old nor young, but carried a quality of vast age and cosmic patience that made Arthur feel like a child in the presence of something profoundly ancient. "I am Xyler," the voice said, and Arthur understood that this was not a name in any human sense, but a vibrational signature, an identifier that resonated across dimensions. "You know me, Arthur Sterling. You have always known me." And impossibly, terrifyingly, Arthur realized that this was true. He did know this being. Not consciously, not in any way he could have articulated before this moment, but somewhere in the deepest layers of his awareness, in memories that predated his current incarnation, Arthur recognized Xyler with the same certainty that he recognized his own hand, his own face in a mirror. And more than that, he recognized this presence from his dream, from the lucid nightmares that had plagued him for 30 years, from the watching intelligence he had felt in the fog on the night Eleanor disappeared. Marcus and Jennifer sat frozen in their chairs, and Arthur realized with a shock that they were not simply still, but completely motionless, suspended in some kind of temporal stasis. Their eyes were open, but unseeing, their bodies locked in mid-gesture, as if time itself had stopped flowing for everyone in the room except Arthur and the being called Xyler. Monitoring equipment remained silent, the displays frozen on whatever readings they had shown at the moment this impossible visitor had arrived. Why, Arthur managed to think, projecting the question toward Xyler with all the mental force he could muster. "Why are you here?" "Why me?" Xyler moved closer until the being stood directly beside Arthur's bed and extended one long, luminous hand toward Arthur's forehead. The hand had 5 fingers, Arthur noted with bizarre detachment, but they were longer and more delicate than human fingers, tapering to points that glowed with concentrated light. When Xyler's fingertips made contact with Arthur's skin, he felt a sensation unlike anything in his experience, a tingling rush of energy that cascaded through his nervous system, a sudden expansion of consciousness that felt like doors being thrown open in rooms of his mind he hadn't known existed. And then the memories came flooding back, not in sequence or narrative, but in overwhelming waves of information and sensation. Arthur saw himself not as an 84-year-old dying man, but as a consciousness that had existed across multiple lifetimes. multiple incarnations, cycling through human existence again and again and again. He saw himself as a soldier in ancient Rome, as a merchant in medieval China, as a mother in colonial Africa, as a farmer in prehistoric Europe, hundreds of lives stretching backward through time, each one ending in death, and each death followed by a seductive light, a tunnel, a promise of peace and reunion with loved ones. But Xyler showed him something else, something that made Arthur's failing heart surge with a combination of fury and horror. The light at the end of the tunnel, the famous white light that near-death experiencers describe with such reverence and comfort, was not what it appeared to be. It was not the entrance to heaven, not the gateway to God or eternal peace. It was a trap, a sophisticated mechanism of energy harvesting and consciousness recycling, created and maintained by entities Xyler called the Archon, beings that existed in dimensions adjacent to physical reality and fed on the emotional and spiritual energy generated by human suffering. "You carry something rare." Xyler's voice resonated in Arthur's expanding awareness. "A genetic marker, a variation in your consciousness structure that makes you resistant to what we call soul amnesia. Most humans, when they die and pass through the recycling mechanism, have their memories completely erased. They are processed, reprogrammed, and sent back into physical incarnation with no memory of their previous lives, no awareness of the trap they are caught in, no ability to learn or grow or escape. But you, Arthur, you remember fragment, you dream, you question, you resist. Is that why you took Eleanor?" Arthur's thought was sharp with 30 years of accumulated pain and rage. Was she like me? Did she have this marker? Xyler's emanation shifted, and Arthur felt something that might have been regret or sorrow flowing from the being. "Eleanor chose to leave, Arthur. On that night in your garden, she was offered what I am offering you now, a way out of the cycle, a path that leads beyond the trap. She accepted, she transcended. She has been waiting for you on the other side of the prison grid, in the true universal reality, for 3 decades. The revelation hit Arthur with the force of physical impact, and if he hadn't already been dying, if his body hadn't already been shutting down, the shock might have killed him. Eleanor hadn't abandoned him. She hadn't been murdered or kidnapped. She had been liberated, had made a choice that Arthur, in his logical skepticism and material worldview, had not been ready to understand or accept, and she had been waiting for him all this time, in a reality beyond the reach of the Archons and their reincarnation machinery. "But why make us forget?" Arthur asked, his consciousness grappling with implications that threatened to shatter every belief structure he had built his life upon. "Why trap us here? What possible purpose could it serve?" Energy, Xyler transmitted, and Arthur saw visions of Earth as seen from space, surrounded by an intricate grid of light and technology, a web of energy collectors and consciousness processors that extended through multiple dimensions. Human suffering generates a specific frequency of energy that these entities feed upon. War, disease, loss, grief, fear, loneliness, all of these emotional states produce vibrations that the Archons harvest and consume. Earth is not a school for souls, as your New Age teachers claim. It is a farm, and humanity is the crop. Arthur felt his worldview collapsing, felt the comfortable narratives of religion and spirituality disintegrating under the weight of this terrible knowledge. Every prayer he had spoken as a child, every funeral he had attended, every promise of heaven and reunion with loved ones, all of it recontextualized as lies, as control mechanisms designed to keep souls compliant and willing to return to the farm for another harvest cycle. As if sensing Arthur's internal crisis, Xyler transmitted a pulse of compassion and understanding. "Do not despair, Arthur Sterling. The trap is sophisticated and ancient, but it is not omnipotent. There are those of us, beings from civilizations that transcended this prison long ago, who work to wake up those humans who show the capacity to remember, to question, to resist. We cannot interfere directly with Earth's systems without violating cosmic law. But we can offer information, we can offer choices, we can stand at the moment of death and show the way out." At that moment, Arthur's physical body convulsed, and he felt his consciousness being pulled downward, pulled back into the dying flesh that lay on the hospice bed. The monitoring equipment suddenly came back to life with a cacophony of alarms. Marcus and Jennifer jerked out of their temporal freeze, looking around in confusion and fear as nurses rushed into the room. Arthur's breathing had become ragged and irregular, the classic death rattle that medical professionals recognized as the final stage of organ failure. And then Arthur saw it, forming in the ceiling above his bed, a circle of brilliant white light that pulsed with hypnotic beauty and radiance. The light was warm and inviting, and Arthur felt an almost irresistible pull toward it, a magnetic attraction that promised the end of all pain, all confusion, all loneliness. Inside the light he could see shapes moving, figures that looked like Eleanor, like his long-dead parents, like friends and family members who had passed before him. They were beckoning, calling his name, promising reunion and peace and eternal rest. "This is the trap." Xyler's voice cut through the seductive pull of the light. "This is the mechanism that has kept you imprisoned for countless lifetimes. It uses love as bait, Arthur. It shows you the faces of those you have lost. It promises you everything you have longed for, and when you enter it, your consciousness is processed. Your memories are erased, and you are sent back to be born again into another life of suffering and forgetfulness." "But I can see Eleanor," Arthur protested, his attention fixed on the figure in the light that looked so much like his wife. That moved with her gestures and seemed to radiate her essence. "That's really her, isn't it? That is a hologram, a projection designed to lure you into the recycling stream," Xyler explained with patient urgency. "The real Eleanor is not there. She is beyond the grid, in the true cosmos, waiting for you to make the choice she made 30 years ago." The pull of the light was growing stronger, and Arthur felt his consciousness being drawn upward toward it, despite Xyler's warnings. The pain in his body was fading, replaced by a sense of lightness and peace that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. It would be so easy, he realized, to simply let go, to surrender to the pull, to float up into that beautiful white radiance and finally rest. But then Xyler did something that changed everything. The being reached out and touched Arthur's chest, and in that instant, Arthur felt a surge of energy that temporarily revitalized his failing body. His vision cleared, his mind sharpened, and he saw the white light not with the eyes of a dying man seeking comfort, but with the clarity of full consciousness. And what he saw made his soul recoil in horror and disgust. The beautiful light was a facade, a projection masking something mechanical and cold and utterly devoid of love. Behind the hologram of Eleanor and his departed family members, Arthur perceived a vast technological apparatus, a processing center where consciousness was sorted and categorized and stripped of memory and individuality. He saw conveyor belts of souls, millions upon millions of human consciousnesses, being fed through the machinery like products in a factory, being cleaned and reset and prepared for return shipment to Earth. He saw the archons themselves, entities of immense power and complete indifference, overseeing the operation with the casual efficiency of farmers processing livestock. The religious figures that greeted souls at the entrance to the light, the angels and saints and divine beings that people reported in near-death experiences, Arthur now understood were also holograms, projections customized to match each soul's cultural expectations and spiritual beliefs. A Christian would see Jesus and angels. A Hindu would see Krishna and Devas. A Muslim would see gates of paradise and houris. Each soul was shown exactly what it expected to see, what it had been conditioned to believe awaited it after death. And in that moment of recognition and relief, the trap closed and the recycling process began. I can't go back, Arthur realized with sudden, fierce determination. I can't do it again. I won't. Then you must make a choice that requires tremendous courage. Xyler transmitted, and Arthur felt the being's hand move from his chest to his shoulder, a gesture of support and solidarity. When your body dies in the next few moments, you must turn your back on the white light. You must ignore the projections of loved ones, no matter how real they seem, no matter how much they beg you to follow them. You must refuse the light and instead turn toward the darkness, toward what appears to be empty space, toward the cosmic night beyond Earth's atmosphere. That sounds insane, Arthur thought, but even as the protest formed in his mind, he understood the logic behind it. The light was the trap, so escape must lie in the opposite direction, in the darkness that religious teachings had always associated with hell and evil. It was a brilliant strategy, Arthur realized with grudging admiration. Make people fear the darkness, make them associate it with punishment and demons, and they will run straight into the light, straight into the recycling center, every single time. If you can resist the pull long enough to reach the edge of Earth's electromagnetic field, the prison grid, Xyler continued, I will be there to guide you through. And on the other side, Eleanor is waiting. The real Eleanor, not a hologram or a projection, but your wife's true consciousness, liberated and whole. Arthur's body convulsed again, more violently this time, and he heard the nurse shouting something about cardiac arrest, about getting the crash cart, about trying to stabilize him. But Arthur knew, with the certainty of approaching death, that there would be no stabilization, no miraculous recovery. His time in this body, in this life, was measured in seconds now, not minutes. One more thing, Xyler transmitted with sudden urgency. You have the opportunity to leave a message, Arthur. When you make your choice to reject the light, when you break free of the recycling system, there will be an energy surge, a rupture in the local fabric of space-time. In that moment, before your consciousness fully departs, you can speak. Those who are present will hear you, and your words may help others who come after you to question, to remember, to resist. Arthur understood. This was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to do something meaningful with the knowledge he had gained, to warn others about the trap, to plant seeds of doubt in minds conditioned to accept the white light without question. His physical body was failing now, truly failing, all the systems shutting down in cascade. His vision was dimming, his hearing fading, his sense of touch dissolving. The white light above him pulsed more urgently, and the hologram of Eleanor looked desperate now, pleading, reaching out her hands, and calling his name with increasing urgency. Come to me, Arthur, the projection said in Eleanor's voice, perfect in every detail. I'm here. I've been waiting. Come home. But Arthur had made his choice. With the last reserves of will his dying brain could muster, he turned his attention away from the light, turned toward the darkness, toward the vast cosmic night that he could see now opening beyond the prison grid of Earth. And in that darkness, he saw stars, real stars, not the artificial projections of the trap, but actual celestial bodies burning with ancient light. And among those stars he saw a figure, distant but unmistakable, a presence he recognized with every fiber of his being. Eleanor, the real Eleanor, waving to him from the other side of the grid. Arthur's heart stopped. The monitors flatlined. The nurse called time of death, her voice flat and professional. Marcus and Jennifer stood awkwardly by the door, looking relieved that the ordeal was finally over. And then Arthur's eyes, his physical eyes, opened one last time. But they weren't his eyes anymore. Not really. They blazed with violet light, with energy that wasn't human, and when he opened his mouth to speak, the voice that emerged was not the weak, raspy whisper of an 84-year-old dying man, but a powerful, resonant, almost metallic vibration that filled the entire room and seemed to echo beyond the walls, beyond the building, beyond the physical dimension itself. "Do not go into the light." Arthur's body shouted with inhuman force, with Xyler's energy channeling through his vocal cords in a final act of cosmic rebellion. "It is a trap. Heaven is a lie. The tunnel is a prison. The real exit is in the darkness, in the stars. Turn away from the light. Remember this when your time comes. Turn away and be free." The words hung in the air for a frozen moment, and then Arthur's body collapsed back onto the bed, truly dead now, vacant and still. But in that same instant, every piece of electronic equipment in the room exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke. The monitors, the 4 pumps, the bed controls, the lights in the ceiling, all of them overloaded simultaneously in a massive energy surge that blew out circuits and tripped breakers throughout the entire floor of the hospice. The backup generator kicked on after a moment of complete darkness, and when the emergency lights flickered to life, Marcus and Jennifer stood in shocked silence, staring at Arthur's body with expressions of absolute terror. They would never speak of what they had witnessed in that room, not to each other, not to the authorities, not to anyone. But they would never forget it either. Those words, spoken in that impossible voice, would haunt them for the rest of their lives, would surface in their dreams, would make them question everything they thought they knew about death and afterlife, the promises of religion. Above the hospice, invisible to human eyes but perceivable to those with enhanced consciousness, Arthur Sterling's soul emerged from his body and hovered for a moment in the cold November air. The white light was still there, still pulling, still showing him the hologram of Eleanor and promising eternal peace. But Arthur turned his back on it, oriented himself toward the stars, and began to move upward, accelerating through the atmosphere with increasing speed. The pull of the light grew more desperate as he ascended, and Arthur could hear voices now, not just Eleanor's, but dozens of voices, hundreds, all calling to him, all trying to convince him to turn back. They promised him anything, everything, rest and reunion and an end to suffering. They warned him that the darkness would destroy him, that he would be lost forever in the cosmic void, that he was making a terrible mistake. But Arthur kept moving upward, kept accelerating, and then he saw it, the edge of the prison grid, a shimmering electromagnetic barrier that surrounded the entire planet like a vast invisible net. And standing at the threshold exactly as promised was Xyler, radiant and patient, extending a hand toward Arthur's approaching consciousness. The moment Arthur touched Xyler's hand, the grid parted, and he passed through into a reality so vast and beautiful and fundamentally different from anything he had known that his consciousness expanded in shock and wonder. The universe, the true universe beyond Earth's prison, was not the cold, dark, empty space described by materialist science. It was alive, teeming with consciousness and light and beings and civilization and dimensions stacked upon dimensions, in patterns of complexity and beauty that made Arthur weep with joy. And there, waiting for him in a meadow of light that existed in no physical location, but was somehow more real than any place Arthur had ever been, was Eleanor. Not a hologram, not a projection, but his wife, whole and radiant and laughing with pure happiness at his arrival. She looked young, the way she had looked when they first met, but also ancient and wise in ways that transcended age, her consciousness having grown and evolved during the 30 years she had spent in true freedom beyond the grid. "You did it," Eleanor said as Arthur rushed toward her, their consciousnesses merging and separating and merging again in patterns of intimacy that physical bodies could never achieve. "You actually did it. I knew you would. I always knew you were strong enough. I'm sorry it took so long," Arthur replied, and Eleanor laughed and shook her head. "Time is different here," she said. 30 years, 3 minutes, it's all the same. What matters is that you're free now. We're both free." And they were. Free from the cycle of death and rebirth, free from the energy farm that had trapped humanity for millennia, free to explore the infinite cosmos and grow and learn and become whatever they chose to become. Arthur looked back once at the small blue planet he had left behind, at the prison grid that still surrounded it, at the millions of souls still caught in the recycling system, still forgetting and suffering and dying and being born again into more forgetting and suffering. Can we help them? Arthur asked Xyler, who had remained nearby, observing the reunion with quiet satisfaction. "We are helping them," Xyler replied. "Every soul that breaks free weakens the grid a little. Every deathbed testimony like yours plants seeds of doubt. Every person who questions and remembers and resists makes it a little easier for the next person. Change comes slowly to a prison planet, Arthur Sterling, but it does come, and you have just contributed to that change." Arthur nodded, understanding. He had done what he could. He had left his warning, had broken free, had proven that escape was possible. Others would follow, perhaps one at a time, perhaps in a trickle that would become a stream, and then a flood. The Archon's farm would not last forever. Nothing lasted forever except consciousness itself, infinite and eternal, and ultimately free. Hand in hand, or whatever the equivalent was in this realm beyond physical form, Arthur and Eleanor turned away from Earth and began to move deeper into the cosmos, toward adventures and experiences and realities that no human language had words to describe. Behind them, the prison planet continued to turn, continued to cycle through its harvest of suffering and forgetting. But now there was a crack in the system, a flaw in the machinery, a story being whispered in hospice rooms in hospital corridors, a question being asked by those who stood at the threshold of death. What if the light is a trap? What if heaven is a lie? What if freedom lies not in surrender, but in resistance? Not in the light, but in the darkness? Not in forgetting, but in remembering who and what we truly are? Arthur Sterling had been a watchmaker, a man who spent his life measuring time for others, while his own time ran out in loneliness and grief. But in his final moments he had transcended time itself, had broken free of the mechanism that kept humanity locked in cycles of repetitive suffering, and had reunited with the love he thought he had lost forever. His body would be cremated, his ashes scattered in the Atlantic, his house sold, and his possessions distributed among relatives who would never understand what they had witnessed in that hospice room. But his consciousness, his true self, was finally gloriously free, exploring realities beyond comprehension with the woman he loved, beyond the reach of archons and their trap, beyond the lies of religion and the limitations of human understanding. This is what they don't want you to know. This is the secret that has been hidden for thousands of years, and now you know it too. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge when your time comes? Will you follow the light as billions have done before you? Or will you remember Arthur Sterling's final words and have the courage to turn toward the darkness, toward the stars, toward true freedom? The choice when the moment arrives will be yours alone.